appreciate everybody for being here tonight. I know it's sometimes holidays or big family days, and maybe you've already spent some time with your family, and maybe you had to cancel some time with your family. Maybe you brought your family here, so that's great if you did. But we're glad that you're here tonight to study the Word. I want to kind of review for a moment some of the things that we're talking about this quarter as we think about surveying the signs in the Gospel of John. I do this for the benefit of some maybe who are visiting with us tonight and maybe haven't been here for the other classes, so that we don't just jump into a text without some sense of the context that we're studying. So we're looking in this quarter, we're looking at the 7 signs of Jesus in John. There's really 7 major signs that you read about in this gospel. The purpose of John's writing, which we studied about in our first class, is he writes so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. And so he makes an argument with every sign that he uses, trying to prove why Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Son of God. And so we talked about, in one of our first classes, we talked about Jesus turning water into wine in John chapter 2, proving that Jesus has the power to change what would naturally occur. And so he turns water into wine. Doesn't have to wait for the water to go through the vine and then up into the grape. He just instantly does it. Turns water into wine. He heals the nobleman's son. We talked about that last week in John chapter 4. So we have a nobleman who comes to him and says that his son is sick and near death, and Jesus heals him right on the spot. He doesn't even have to go to his house. He doesn't have to lay his hands on him. He just says the word, and from a distance, Jesus heals the nobleman's son. Tonight, we're going to look at Jesus healing the lame man outside of the pool of Bethesda that you read about John 5. Future classes, we're going to look at John 6, Jesus feeding the 5,000. The only miracle besides the resurrection that's in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. In fact, normally, John uses miracles and signs that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He includes stories that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, probably because he was writing at a later date and he was supplementing what he already knew had been written about. But in that case, he writes about the feeding the 5,000. We're going to look at Jesus walking on water from John 6, Jesus healing the blind man around another pool of Siloam in John chapter 9, and then Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So that's where we've been, that's where we're going, and looking at John 5 today, where Jesus asked the question, do you want to be made well? Now, last week, we mentioned that in our first 2 signs we looked at, those are part of what's called the Cana cycle in John chapters 2 through 4. So Jesus went to Cana of Galilee in John 2, and that's where he turned the water into wine. He does some other things like cleans out the temple, has a conversation with Nicodemus, goes to Samaria, has a conversation with the Samaritan woman. Then he heals the nobleman's son, which is back in Cana, and that's why it's called the Cana cycle. So John 2 through 4 is kind of a picture of that. But what we're looking at here today, beginning today, is what's called the festival cycle, when sometimes scholars and people who study Scripture try to break it down and try to categorize what John does. Some people would refer to this as the festival cycle. And I think just a quick look at this chart helps you understand why. First of all, if you look at John chapter 5, verse 1, which will be our first verse we look at today, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So chapter 5 starts with a feast. Then when you get to chapter 10, it's going to largely end with the feast of dedication. In between, John chapter 6 and verse 4, you have the Passover, and you have the Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 7, and then the Feast of Dedication, which happens in winter, which is what we would call today, or refer to today as Hanukkah. That would be the Feast of Dedication that he attended. All right. Let's read the text. Hopefully that helps give you a little bit of a picture as to where we've been, where we're going, and the big picture as to where we're at. John chapter 5, verse 1. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, I want to just remind you really quickly that the sheep gate is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. When they were rebuilding the walls, one of the gates that they rebuilt was the sheep gate. And it's called the sheep gate because that's where they brought the sheep in to sacrifice the animals in Jerusalem at the temple. And so that's where they are. That gives you a really specific locale. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So it's right outside of that sheep gate. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed and took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, and so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" And now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." And the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, if you read 2 more verses, which I don't have here on the screen, but verse 17 says, Jesus answered them, "My Father has been working until now, and I have been working, and therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God." All right, so what you see here is the beginning of the Jews starting to get jealous of Jesus, angry with Jesus. He's breaking what they think are their traditions, and they're starting to hunt down and sort of attack and question and be suspicious of Jesus. I want you to note that, along with, I want you to turn to John chapter 10 for a moment, because I want you to notice that in John 5, it's one of the first clear declarations where Jesus calls God his Father, which was an indication he was claiming to be deity, which is one of the things that angered them beyond the Sabbath. But one of the reasons it's called the festival cycle as well, and why it starts with John 5 and ends with John 10, is because the same thing happens in John 10. So it's like it starts with this idea, I'm claiming equality with the Father, but then if you look at John chapter 10 and you notice verse 30, he says, "I and my Father are one." So here we are at the end of John 10, and then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. So he makes them mad to start off John 5, and then when you get to John 10, he's making them mad again because he's claiming equality with the Father. He's claiming to be deity, and they think that's not right. Nobody has the right to claim deity. You are blaspheming. We're going to stone you. Well, you don't have the right to claim it if you're not it. But if you are, which he's proving with every sign, with every miracle, you do have the right to claim it, and he did by those statements. And they understood that when he made those statements. All right. Well, let's take a look through some of the questions here. There's some questions in your booklet. If you didn't get a booklet, there's one in the back. There's multiple ones in the back, and feel free to grab one on your way out today. So John notes in chapter 5, verse 1, Jesus had gone up to Jerusalem to keep a feast of the Jews. And he previously had noted how Jesus kept the Passover. So we actually see another feast in John 2. It's the Passover. Every time it's a Passover, John notes it as the Passover. Now, why might these details be important, that he's keeping the feasts? Why might those details be important as we consider the command of Deuteronomy 16, verse 16? He's a Jew. He's following the law at this time, right? So it indicates that Jesus was a law-abiding Jew. He kept the law. That's important because Jesus is sinless, and for him to be our sinless sacrifice, he has to have kept the law perfectly, which is something that no one else had ever done. And so every time it mentions to you that he's keeping the law, it's an indication that he's doing what a good, obedient Jew would do. Deuteronomy 16, verse 16 required that a law-abiding Jew would go to Jerusalem and keep these feasts that are mentioned in Deuteronomy 16. It says 3 times a year, all your males, that be Jesus, shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. And the feast of booths is also called the Feast of Tabernacles. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. So they were to come, and they were also to make an offering there as well. And so Jesus was keeping those feasts. And John is careful to point that out. He can't be our perfect Lamb of God, our perfect sacrifice, if he wasn't keeping the law perfectly. And so he was. Why would there... I already answered this question. I'm sorry, I ruined it for somebody. But yeah, there needs to be a sheep gate in Jerusalem because that's where they were offering sacrifices. They were bringing sheep in to offer sacrifices in the temple. So who had John previously declared was the fulfillment of all these lambs?
Jesus is the gate.
Jesus is the gate. Good. I like that too. And he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So extra credit for that because I wasn't going there. But that's a great point, actually. Take a look at this map work. We showed you this last week. I like to emphasize that these things happen in real places to real people at real times. And so this was the one that we looked at last week. What I want you to notice, last week we looked at, there you are, number 6, Jesus up here in Cana of Galilee. That's where he heals the nobleman's son. But there's some things that have happened between what we read about in John 4 and what we're going to read about in John 5. For example, he's going to begin his Galilean ministry. He's going to go live in Capernaum for a while. Luke 4 notes that. If you look at Luke's gospel, there's the great catch of fish. John doesn't write about the great catch of fish, but Luke does, and that would have happened between the nobleman's son being healed and this miracle. He calls Simon, Andrew, James, and John in Matthew chapter 4. He says, "Follow me." So that they can become fishers of men. So that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 4. So that has happened. Take a look at our next map here. And he has kept that second Passover in Jerusalem, which people would date that around 28 AD. That's what's mentioned in John chapter 5, verse 1. So that's kind of where we are in terms of a time frame. And he's going to heal the man at the pool of Bethesda. Now jump over to this chart. Can you see that? This is kind of an inset map of Jerusalem, but I just want you to notice where that pool of Bethesda is. It'll be up here on the north side. Here's the temple, and outside of the temple would be, you've got the pool of Israel, and you've got the pools of Bethesda. There's actually 2 pools. There was a north pool, there was a south pool, and it was split off by a dam. And the ones that have been excavated today will actually be, I think, the south and the southern pool. We're going to talk about the pool of Siloam when we get to John 9, but the pool of Siloam is down here on the south side of the city. So you got the pool of Bethesda on the north side of Jerusalem. You got the pool of Siloam on the south side. Both of those have been excavated in recent years, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in archaeological journals and magazines about those particular places. I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. So, is this a real place? Yes, right? What do we know? What do you know about the Pool of Bethesda today? Anybody been to Jerusalem, done the tour? Yeah, great. Did you guys go visit the Pool of Bethesda when you went? We have eyewitnesses in the audience today. I just want to point that out. Yes.
We didn't get healed.
You didn't get healed? Okay. You seem like you're doing pretty well. So what superstition was connected to it in the first century? He already alluded to it, the healing. Yeah. There was this idea that, right, there's the idea that an angel would come down, stir up the waters, and whoever jumped into the water first would get healed. And this guy that's been lame for 38 years is like, I never can beat people into the pool. And so that's why I still have this problem, because they jump in front of me. So this is kind of a picture of, you can see the ruins of the pool of Bethesda here. That's it's kind of hard to envision when you're trying to just highlight a certain section. Let me look at a couple more pictures. I like to point this one out because it's actually, there's this date, if you go visit it, where they have this plaque on the pool that says the southern pool. That's the one that they've excavated the most, because there's actually some structures on top of the northern pool now, so you can't ask people to tear their house down so you can excavate it. But the southern pool, it says 1st century BCE. So that's the time that Jesus would have been there, 1st century BCE. So you can still go visit the excavation, the ruins of that southern pool today. Now, I like to point this particular picture out because you see the steps. Anybody that is lame, crippled, paralyzed, does it look like those are easy steps to take down to the pool? No. And then if you get a little closer, this is what the southern pool would have looked like. There would have been these large, sloped steps that went down to the pool. So you have to get down there in the first place, and then you have all these people on these large slopes that have been covered by grass now, because these are just ruins that haven't really been touched very much. And so it'd be difficult for somebody who's infirm to jump in front of the other people who are in this busy city in there. What you see on the right-hand side is actually kind of a diagram of the northern basin where that sits. That's the blue lines at the top. And then there's the southern basin. That's what we're looking at right now. Those are the blue lines there at the bottom. You can actually see the black lines there. Those are where there's a chapel there and there's a church there. There's structures on top of that. That's why they haven't excavated the northern part of the pool very much, because it's covered with other structures now that have been built over top of it. All right. This is what Barclay says in his commentary. He says, ancient peoples were specially impressed with the holiness of water, especially of rivers and springs. Sir J.G. Fraser, in Folklore in the Old Testament, quotes many instances of this reverence for water. Hesiod, the Greek poet, said that when a man was about to ford a river, he should pray and wash his hands. For he who wades through a stream with unwashed hands incurs the wrath of the gods. And when the Persian king Xerxes came to the Strymon in Thrace, his magicians offered white horses and went through other ceremonies before the army ventured to cross. Usolus, the Roman general, offered a bull to the river Euphrates before he crossed it. And to this day in Southeast Africa, some of the Bantu tribes believe that rivers are inhabited by malignant spirits, which must be propitiated by flinging a handful of corn or some other offering into the river before it is crossed. The people who waited for the pool in Jerusalem to be disturbed were children of their age, believing the things of their age. Does that make sense? And so I think that little injection that you see in verse 4, I believe it is, where it talks about people were waiting for the angel to stir the waters, is just an insertion there that indicates what the people of the age believed. What kind of people were regularly gathered around here? What's verse 3 say? Sick, lame, disabled, paralyzed, blind, waiting for the moving of the water. Who specifically does Jesus notice in this text? Lame man for 38 years. Why do you think he picks that guy instead of somebody who's just got a headache that day? What's that?
Why would he keep coming every year when nothing happened? Just a bit.
Okay.
It would be evident to all that someone who was previously not well is now been made well, showing his power.
Yeah, this would be an undeniable miracle that everybody knew this guy had been infirm for 38 years. So when he got healed, they would know something miraculous had to have happened here for this to have occurred. So it's just an undeniable instance of Jesus healing. So interesting. I want to thank Santa for what they dropped off for me. That was kind of, but interesting. I don't know, it's different down here in Alabama. My wife is sick, but Santa did not leave any cookies or hot chocolate last night. And the head of the household was kind of disappointed in that. Anyway, so I appreciate Santa. How long had this man had an infirmity? 38 years. Now, take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 2. I don't know if there's a connection to this. I don't know if the Bible really makes a connection. I know a lot of commentators make a connection. But look at Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 14. Where's the other place you find the number 38 in Scripture? It's right here. It says, the time that we took, in fact, I think I had it in the slide. No, I didn't. The time that we took to come from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the valley of the Sea Red was 38 years. That's how long the people were wandering in the wilderness, 38 years. Until all the generation of the men of war was consumed from the midst of the camp, just as the Lord had sworn to them. So it's just kind of interesting that John, that's the particular number of years this person's been infirm. Perhaps it's just a picture of, well, just like these people wandered in the wilderness for 38 years, and then finally Joshua led them in as the captain into the promised land. Here's Jesus, who helps a man who's been infirm for 38 years. He's going to heal him, just like Jesus. Even though you have been in your sin for many, many years, he can give you healing, spiritual revival in your life. I don't know if that's intentional on John's part. I don't know if anybody really knows, but it's interesting, I think. So what question does Jesus ask this man?
If you want to be made well.
Does that seem like a silly question to you?
An obvious question.
An obvious question, but
An obvious answer.
you think? Do you think everybody that's not well wants to be made well?
I've known people that I didn't think that really wanted to get well because they seemed to enjoy their infirmities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If everybody wants to be made well, then why aren't more people coming to churches? We're offering spiritual healing. We're offering help. And you might even ask them, do you want to be forgiven of your sins? Do you want to? And they don't. Some people don't. And maybe this guy doesn't. I don't know. But Jesus asked the question, and what's his reply? There's nobody to help me into the water. So what does he seem to think it takes to be made well?
You're number one.
You got to be the first one in the water. What does Jesus prove to him? You don't have to be the first one in the water.
You don't need the water.
You just need me.
You don't need the angel coming. You don't need the water.
You just need me. And so Jesus doesn't want this man to put his faith in the ritual. He wants to put his faith in him. I'm the one that can make you well. And so Jesus asked this question. I'm gonna move on to the next question here. Now, what spiritual lesson? We'll get into this in our next class that we have when we study the rest of the John 5 context. Because Jesus has a miracle, but then he has a speech, a discourse, if you will, based on the miracle in the rest of John 5. We're just looking at the miracle really today. So what spiritual lesson does Jesus continue to make to the Jewish people, which relates back to his question when you read John 5, 39 and 40? What's he trying to point out to them there? Somebody that's there, can you read verses 39 and 40 for us?
You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me, and you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have it.
You are unwilling to come to me. You need to come to me. You're putting your faith in the scriptures, but which is the scriptures talk about me, but the scriptures are telling you to come to me. Just like the unwell man needed to come to Jesus, Jesus is telling all the people who are criticizing the man and criticizing Jesus for healing on Sabbath, you need me. So come to me so that you can have life. So spiritually speaking, when we've been bound to sin for a long time, because what we've tried to do with every one of these signs is say this isn't just about Jesus did something cool. This is about Jesus performed a miracle that has a spiritual meaning for each of us that we need to take home. So when we've been bound to sin for a long time, how do we begin to act in a similar way to this man? Blame it on somebody else. I'm in this situation because nobody's really helped me.
I have a desire to come to Jesus.
You've got to have a real desire to come. Sometimes you get hopeless. You feel like, I'm never going to get better. I've been this way for 38 years. And I think one of the things we can learn from this is that Jesus gives hope to people who sometimes feel like they're hopeless. He helps people who feel like they're beyond help. And that's maybe the thing we need to take home. There are people who maybe don't, in their mind, think that Jesus can do anything to help them, and we need to try to convince them Jesus can. Come to him, because he can. Russell?
He was a legitimately paralyzed individual. He could not, I mean, he did probably need help to do anything in his life. Because if he was paralyzed, his legs don't work, or his extremities don't work, something. So he needed help.
Mm-hmm.
He just was proven who the true help was instead of the angel in the water.
Yeah, good.
It's interesting that the man previously had no faith in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't take faith previous in order for Jesus to heal someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, which is different than what you see in the previous miracle we studied in John 4, where he does believe. His belief gets deeper as he goes, but we don't actually see an evidence of belief yet. We may not really see it until Jesus meets him in the temple, because it...
Well, but he did get up, which is an indication
of action.
that something
Okay.
happened.
Good. All right. This is a couple quotes, but I like what Kossenberger says here in Signs of the Messiah. It says, to the invalid's mind, his is a futile task. How can he be first in the water when he is unable to walk? Humanly speaking, he'll never be able to access healing. Yet Jesus pointedly cuts straight through any such nonsense. In our lives, there may be times when we face seemingly insurmountable obstacles to God meeting our needs or answering our prayers. And yet what we fail to see is that what appears to be impossible to us is possible for God. I think that's one of the take-home lessons from this. All right. How quickly is this man healed? At once, immediately. He doesn't have to go to rehab. No physical therapist or occupational therapist. I always get those two mixed up. I'm sorry, because I know there's some people here that do that. But he doesn't need any of that. Immediately he is healed. Immediately he rolls up his bed and he just starts walking away with it. What day does this occur? Sabbath. Oh boy. What's the big deal about that?
You can't work on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
You can't do things on the Sabbath.
So
But you have to decide what work is.
that's right. That's right. And so the Pharisees are seeing this guy carrying around his cot. In their mind, you're working. And then he says, I'm working because the guy that healed me told me that I could do this. And so now, well, who's the guy that told you could do this, right? Because he's telling you that you can work. And he's working because he healed you. And so they're after him now. So it happens on the Sabbath day, and that's why it's an issue. Because there are a lot of people that were very concerned about breaking the Sabbath. All right. Take a look at Barclay's quote here, which kind of, whenever you study the Gospels, you're going to get into the Pharisees' traditions versus what was actually law. And you read quotes like this from time to time. But it says, the Jews set out 39 different classifications of work. One of which was that it consisted in carrying a burden. So carrying that cot would have broken their list of classifications of work. The rabbis of Jesus' day solemnly argued that a man was sinning if he carried a needle in his robe on the Sabbath. They even argued as to whether he could wear his artificial teeth or his wooden leg. To them, all this petty detail was a matter of life and death, and certainly this man was breaking the rabbinic law by carrying his bed on the Sabbath day. So that's why they're pretty serious about it. And as you can tell by some of those little laws they had, they were concerned about this. Well, why did the one who was healed not know who helped him?
Jesus left.
Jesus melted into the crowd.
Didn't know who he was. Jesus healed him. Jesus just kind of went away. Why do you think Jesus would have done it? What lessons can we learn from that?
It wasn't his hour yet.
Okay. He wanted people to focus on the miracle, didn't want to make it all about him necessarily, although later he does make it about him with the individual in his private conversation. Ministry without recognition. I think that's a good point. You don't always have to get the recognition for the good things that get done. And Jesus here, he performs the ministry, but he doesn't get recognized in front of everybody. Now, there may have been a safety reason for that. When people find out you just healed this guy who's been ill for 38 years, and there's a crowd of people who are all looking for healing, then what are they going to do? Mob them. They're going to crowd around him. Heal me. Touch me. What can you do? Say something about me. Fix me. And so that may have been why he melted away as well, because you could imagine if
He was nondescript looking. He did not look like God. He was like anyone else.
Good. So, yeah, and there's nothing noticeable about the way that he looked that would have caused this guy to have known what was going on. So, there's maybe a few reasons why he handled it that way, but those would be some surmisings. What's the Pharisees' reaction, and what can we learn from it? Man, I'm so happy for you. Is that their reaction? You've had this problem for 38 years, and I just want you, we all wanted to come here to let you know how happy we are. We want to have a party for you because we want to, we're going to have a walking party because you're walking, and this is exciting. This is the day that you got healed. Is that their reaction?
It has to be from
Who
God.
did it?
Who did this? That's it. There's no rejoicing for him, and that really makes them look despicable, doesn't it? I mean, the more you see miracle after miracle where this is their reaction, not genuine rejoicing and happiness for somebody who had been healed, but jealousy for the person who had healed him and then attacking that person, the more it makes them look bad. And so I think there's some things we can learn from that, right? When people have changed their lives, I could preach on this for a little bit, but when people have changed their lives and are starting to turn their life around, be happy for them. Rejoice with them. Don't act pharisaical. And what that means, we could get into the details of that a little bit more. Let me quote a couple things to you. This is from Arthur Pink. He mentions this. I don't agree with a lot of things Arthur Pink says because he really makes a lot of arguments that are Calvinist arguments on John chapter 5. Talks about sovereignty of God, and anybody that's Calvinist is going to make that kind of an argument from John chapter 5. But he makes a point that I think's worth seeing. In John chapter 5, and it's verse 14, Jesus finds him in the temple, and he says to him, "See, you have been made well, sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." So he makes this point. He says, having dealt in grace with the poor, helpless sufferer, Christ now applied the truth. He's extended his grace to someone who may not have even deserved it, not even sure if he wanted it right off the bat, didn't know where to get it, but he extended his grace to him and he's healed. But now he says, sin no more. That's a word for his conscience. Grace does not ignore the requirements of God's holiness. 1 Corinthians 15:34 says, awake to righteousness and sin not. That's still the standard set before us, he writes. Lest a worse thing come unto thee. Reminds us that the believer is still subject to the government of God. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. From Galatians 6:7. That's addressed to believers and not unbelievers. And so, I think that warning is also something to consider. It's not, I healed you, now you can live however you want. You're saved. No, I've healed you, and now you have a responsibility because you know who I am to live according to my will and quit sinning. Turn your life around.
Josh, there's one other possible implication of that, I think, is the fact that it may indicate that the reason he is lame is because of the sin in the first place. And I know there was another miracle where a lame man was healed and was asked who sinned that he was. Jesus said it wasn't anybody sinned in that case. It was just so I'd be glorified. But here it may leave the implication he did cause his own.
Might have been. John 9 is the one where it wasn't because of his sin that he was blind, but in this particular case, very possible that's why Jesus says that. You got yourself in this position because of your sin, and make sure that you've changed that. So that's a good point. It's a fair point.
That's also a good comparison, to say the sin no more, or it's going to be worse consequences than the 38 years that you just went through being lame. Person really,
Right.
like in that situation for that long to understand.
Yeah.
I don't want that or worse than that.
That's a good point. That's a good contrast. Have you guys ever noticed, by the way, that after you've been through a long sickness and you have been praying for help and for healing, that you are sometimes more conscious about your sin and being careful that you make your spiritual life right? I had COVID. I was in the hospital 6 days during COVID, and when I got out of the hospital, because I've been praying, because I was very sick when COVID hit, and when I was in that hospital for a while, and when I remember when I got out, I was preaching on it. I was praying a lot more, and I was trying to recommit, rededicate myself. It was a wake-up call, and sometimes physical consequences of things can be wake-up calls for us spiritually as well. So this is what William Taylor writes. We've got a couple minutes left. He says, while it's wholly unnatural to suppose that he was moved by so diabolical a purpose as that of betraying his benefactor into the hands of his enemies. He's talking about the man who'd just been healed. He tells the Pharisees it was Jesus. So you might read that and you might think, why is he snitching on Jesus? You know, that doesn't seem like a nice thing to do because these guys hate him. It says, in any case, he unwittingly, by his information, stirred up the anger of the Jews, who persecuted Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. And thus, in their view, it was unlawful to make a man whole on the Sabbath, but perfectly lawful to concoct mischief against another and persecute him and seek to slay him on the Sabbath. Isn't that kind of ironic, right? You're working on the Sabbath because you heal somebody, but we're going to go ahead and chase down all these people who witnessed it so that hopefully we can get you killed. Oh, that's okay. You can do that on the Sabbath, right? Interesting contrast between what two people were doing. So when Jesus performed these miracles, what's it prove? What's the goal? These miracles and signs.
To prove who he was.
Prove who he was. Just like John's purpose statement. Okay, he performed these signs to prove that he was the Christ. If you look at John 5 and verse 36, which we'll look at in our next study, it says in verse 36, I have a greater witness than John's. The works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do, bear witness of me, that the Father has sent me. And one of those works would have been this healing. There was a point to this. Now, look at Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah 35 is a foreshadowing of the Messianic age. In verse 3, it says this. It says, strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees. You find a little reference to that in Hebrews 12 as well. It talks about the feeble knees. But it says, say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. And then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame man will leap like a deer. The tongue of the mute will sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. Now, if you were a Pharisee, someone who taught the law, taught the Old Testament scripture, you should be familiar with these passages. And so instead of attacking Jesus when you see a lame man being healed, you instead should let your mind go back to Old Testament passages like these, realizing that this is an evidence that perhaps the Messiah is among us. But that's not where their mind went. Their mind went to attacking Jesus because of their jealousy rather than realizing that this is evidence and that would convict them. Now, this is what McGarvey writes. I'm almost done. Elsewhere, he says, we shall find that Jesus was careful to show that his sabbatic actions were strictly legal. I think that's a good point to make. He wasn't breaking the Sabbath. His actions were strictly legal. But in this case, that he might bring his divine claims plainly before the rulers, he ignored the question as to the human legality of his acts, that he might present without confusion its divine legality. Hence, he used only one order or method of justification. That was an appeal to his divine rights as exhibited in the habits of his Father. It was his divine and not the human in Jesus which wrought this miracle. So Jesus causes the whole controversy to turn on the divine rights, that he may use the occasion for an elaborate discussion of his divine claims and the proofs by which they are sustained, which is what he's going to do throughout the rest of this chapter, which we're going to look at next.